This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight, Dan Kovalik. He's been on before. He's recently visited Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Crimea. He's a attorney. He's a professor who lost a job because the university he was teaching at didn't appreciate some of his views. He's a prolific author. On the show last time, we talked about a book that he wrote. It was The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, how the CIA, the deep state, have conspired to vilify Russia, I would add, and Putin.
Yes.
And there's a series. He's got one that we're going to talk about tonight, The Plot to Overthrow the World. Klaus Schwab, move over. He's got another one, The Plot to Attack Iran and The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Regis. It's always a pleasure.
Well, you've got an impressive list of books that you've written over the last 6-7 years. We're going to talk about The Plot to Overthrow the World tonight. Now, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, but where did that one come from? Now, the subtitle is How the U.S. Spends Billions to Change the Outcome of Elections Around the World. No kidding. So,
Yeah.
Dan, where did that come from? What motivated the book, and when did you publish that?
Yes, so it was my publisher's idea to do the book. They asked me to write that, and it must have been in 2020. They wanted it published before the 2020 elections, and again, kind of as a counter to the narrative that Russia was trying to interfere in the U.S. elections, or that they did in 2016, which of course that's been debunked, and debunked very thoroughly recently by a Department of Justice report. But in any case, they wanted to say, well, what about the U.S. trying to intervene in all these elections around the world and overthrowing governments around the world? So that's how the book came to be.
All right. So how does the United States do that? Is it just with dollars, or are they using other tactics of what they call soft power?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways they do it, of course. Money is a big one, and soft power many times translates into money. But they use various tactics. A lot of it is channeling money and influence through local organizations in targeted countries, where they'll pay groups to do oppositional work against the government. But, some of that may be violent oppositional work. I'll just give one example. I think it's always useful to talk in kind of concrete examples. The first CIA operation that did that was in Iran in 1953. And the way that the CIA carried out that coup against a democratic prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, actually became a template for really modern day coups that the CIA has carried out. I mean, the coups they carry out today look very similar. So what they did in Iran is they would pay people to engage in violent demonstrations against the Mossadegh government with the hope that the Mossadegh government would react in a violent fashion themselves. And that would justify then for them to take escalating action against the government, in this case to support a military coup led by a general that the U.S. picked out to to lead the coup. And they picked him out because, by the way, because he had Nazi sympathies, and they said that made him very reliable. It means he would not be under Soviet influence. And ultimately, it worked. How they ultimately got it to work, it wasn't working for a bit because Mossadegh was a very good guy, very democratic guy, and did not want to react in violent ways against the protesters, who, of course, he didn't realize were being paid by the CIA. So the ambassador, I believe it was the U.S. ambassador to Iran, went to Mossadegh and claimed, though he lied, this was not true, but he claimed that there were protesters that were attacking American citizens living in Tehran. And this really upset Mossadegh because Iranians are known to be very hospitable. They're known for their hospitality, and the idea that foreign guests were being mistreated really upset Mossadegh. And this is what led him actually to order a crackdown on the violent demonstrations. And again, this is what gave them the pretext to send in this general to arrest Mossadegh and take hold of the government and install the Shah of Iran, who is a monarch, was a monarch, So in the name of democracy, they overthrew a prime minister and put in a king. And again, they would follow similar tactics in places like Guatemala in 1954. Recently in Nicaragua, 2018, they've done similar things in Venezuela. So this is at least one means of doing this. I mean, one key thing they try to do, essentially, they attack a foreign country and government in order to force a reaction, in which then they'll say, oh, well, they're violating human rights. And then they'll use that to justify, again, an escalation, which might involve some sort of armed overthrow of the government. Could even, the last resort would be the U.S. actually sending in troops to overthrow the government, as it did in the Dominican Republic in 1965, for example, as it did in Panama in 1989. But that's really a last resort. They would prefer to have local quislings, which I don't know where that term came from, but essentially local puppets to do the job and have some deniability, though that's not always possible.
Well, they've been doing this really all over the world.
Yes.
There are cases that I'd like you to comment on. Right now, for example, again, Serbia, Kosovo. They're in there meddling. I'm going to interview a woman who's been on my show 2 or 3 times already, who is in Belgrade, Serbia. She is an expert. She's the founder of an international group of experts, professors, lawyers, engineers, journalists. And she's been telling me, and we're going to talk specifically about that tonight, what's going on in Serbia, Kosovo, who's behind it. I had another woman on the show. She is from Armenia. And she is a politician in an opposing party. She is an expert on soft power. My goodness. The United States and the CIA and the State Department are all over that country in their decades-long conflict with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. The same thing's happening in Georgia and Abkhazia. The United States is all over it. If you look at Belarus, they tried like heck in the last election to overthrow Lukashenko, and they're still at it. And last but not least, we have Ukraine.
Right.
So, Dan, this is a pattern, and it does involve a lot of money, as you say, but you also indicated that they pay people. I know for a fact they pay politicians. They reward them in various ways. They pay the media. So I'd like your comments on that. It seems to me that's part of the modus operandi.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it is a really multi-front operation they run to essentially try to dominate other countries by essentially, rigging elections and again, forcing governments out of office. As I detail in the book, and I cite a study that was done that was reported even in the mainstream press, is a valid study that, at least as of the time I wrote the book, it was documented that the U.S. had been involved in the rigging of about 81 separate elections in the world. That's an incredible number. And again, as I mentioned in the book, that doesn't even include the more outright coups that the U.S. has supported. And it's not just in, we always think of the U.S. doing that in the developing world, particularly in Latin America, probably most famously. But they also do it in developed countries, even allied countries like Italy after the war, and France and Greece. They moved very affirmatively in those three cases to prevent the Communist Party from being elected in those countries because it was very popular because of its resistance to Hitler. Now they had different tactics in those three countries. I mean, in Greece, ultimately the U.S. and Britain actually, used the military to bring fascism back to Greece. In Italy, they did more covert work again to rig the elections to make sure the communists didn't come to power, and that was true in France as well. But yeah, they do it in many different ways, and in all over the world. It actually is quite incredible how long the reach of the United States is, and how terrible these coups have been. That's the other thing. We're not replacing, dictatorships with democracies. We're generally doing quite the opposite. I give the case of Congo, which does not get enough coverage in the U.S. media at all, or in the Western media. The U.S. has been intervening in Congo in a very direct way, really since at least going back to 1960, when they and the Belgians played a role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Again, a progressive prime minister, the first democratically elected prime minister of Congo. And this was considered the most significant assassination of the 20th century because it paved the way for the U.S. then to put in power Mobutu, the Mobutu dictatorship, which the U.S. would back for the next decades. And then the U.S. got tired of him and helped unseat him, put in power a guy named Laurent Kabila, and then he became unreliable. They got rid of him, and they put in power his son, Joseph Kabila, who was compliant. But in addition to those things, in addition to, just outright overthrowing those leaders, in 1996, the U.S. supported Rwanda, Uganda, and other African countries to invade what then was known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, in order to take control of that country's vast resources. Maybe Congo arguably has more, valuable resources in terms of rare minerals and other resources than any country on earth. If you look at a map, it's a giant country within Central Africa. And in the process of that invasion, about 6 million Congolese were killed. This had to be the biggest bloodletting since the Holocaust in World War II. And yet this is not something that people know anything about for the most part. They've gotten very little coverage. It is not a convenient story. But again, we have stories like that throughout the world. And yeah, in Ukraine in 2014, it needs to be pointed out, as you know very well, Regis, that the U.S. helped also bring about this coup against a president named Yanukovych, who, certainly he had some Russian leanings, but he was actually, what he was trying to do is really straddle kind of the line for Ukraine between Europe and Russia. He really wanted to keep the balance there, and he wanted to keep the balance between the more pro-EU Western Ukraine and the more pro-Russian Eastern Ukraine. He wanted to keep this, again, kind of balance of forces to prevent the balkanization of Ukraine, to prevent civil war. And ultimately, again, the U.S. helped overthrow him through this Maidan protests, and install another president through a coup, through undemocratic processes, right? And the government that was brought to power was pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian, ethnic Ukrainian, anti-Russian ethnic, meaning that they saw their own Russian ethnic and Russian-speaking citizens as second-class citizens. And ultimately, this led to the conflict that Yanukovych was trying to prevent. And that was, in this case, between the more pro-Ukrainian government in Kiev and its own Russian ethnics in the Donbass and Crimea. And a civil conflict broke out in which at least 14,000 people died in that conflict before Russia intervened last year. And again, this is a history that certainly has been intentionally forgotten, especially after Russia did intervene last year, because it's an inconvenient narrative, because what it shows is a couple things. One, that the U.S. has been manipulating the government in Ukraine, even before 2014, but certainly since then. And that the war didn't start last year. It started 9 years ago. And also, it also shows that the war was not unprovoked, of course, that the Russian intervention was not unprovoked, as the U.S. media and the Western governments are trying to claim. That was, I would say that was one of the more significant coups, certainly of this century so far, given the dramatic repercussions which we're seeing right now. And hopefully we won't see even worse repercussions. I mean, obviously this is threatening a World War III. I mean, in many ways, this World War III has already been begun, but it's now limited in scope, and it's limited to really just Ukraine and, yes, maybe to Serbia and Kosovo, but it could spread in a way that World War II did. And again, it's just not a convenient fact for people to discuss in the West, and those of us that try to are seen as conspiracy theorists and whatnot. But it's a reality. I mean, we know this why through a few things, including Victoria Nuland, who still is in the Biden administration, who was Undersecretary of the State Department at the time in 2014. She, in a phone call that was recorded, bragged about how she helped manipulate the coup, how she helped even, take control of who came to power after that coup. So, it's not a secret, but it is an inconvenient fact for the West.
I'm sitting here listening to this, and looking at the list, the number of places, and you mentioned there were 80 separate elections, and that doesn't count the coups that took place. In the United States of America, they've gone crazy over the idea of somebody meddling in the elections when it wasn't Russia at all. As you mentioned, that was conclusively proven without a shred of doubt. And, here we go again, another election coming up, and they're already saying, oh, there's meddling going on. And, Trump is certainly going to use that, I think, leading up to this next election. But it seems to me the United States is pretty doggone good at rigging elections, including its own.
Including its own. And I try to mention that in the book, the connection between trying to dominate other countries and thereby, or as a result, undermining U.S. democracy. And so I give a few examples of this. For example, of course, Nixon ends up being impeached for the Watergate scandal, which was his own attempt to manipulate the elections to win re-election for himself. But really, the genesis or the root cause of Nixon's activities was to cover up his secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos. So again, the foreign intervention led to machinations within our own democracy. Similarly, the U.S. Attempt to, decide who was the government of Iran by overthrowing Mossadegh, putting in power the Shah, then trying to counter the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which overthrew the Shah, led to at least an opening for Ronald Reagan to manipulate the election of 1980 in what is known as the October Surprise, right? Which is probably one of the greatest acts of, democratic manipulation the U.S. has ever seen. And if people don't know what it is, again, this is not something that you learn in school. But so you had this revolution in 1979, which overthrew a U.S.-backed dictator. And at some point after that revolution, students took hostage staff at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And they did so because they feared that the U.S. was going to reinstall the Shah as they had done in 1953. And ultimately, while the students were the ones that took those staff hostage, the government ended up taking hold of the hostages. They kind of took over for them as the captors. So, and that's an important part of the story for what happens next. So that was all happening in 1979 and into 1980. The hostages were held for something like 300 days or something like that, a long time. And on the news, it was a big deal. I mean, when you turn on the news, they'd always have on the screen day 1 of the hostage, day 10 of the hostage, day 100 of the hostage. This is the biggest news in the U.S. at the time, was the hostages being held in Iran. Well, so this became a huge issue for the 1980 election between then President Jimmy Carter, who's running for re-election, against the upstart Ronald Reagan. So Carter was desperately trying to free the hostages, both through military action and also through negotiations with the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in charge of Iran at that time. Reagan, meanwhile, was working behind the scenes to prevent those hostages from being released, because he knew if they were released before the election, Carter could win. So he worked with his friends in the CIA, which he had good connections with because his vice presidential running mate was George Bush, who had been head of the CIA, to undermine Carter's efforts to free the hostages. And he made a deal with Khomeini to have the hostages held through the election of November 1980 and even through his inauguration on January 20th, 1981. And I remember as a kid, seeing this happen, that within hours of Reagan being inaugurated, the hostages were released. which seemed almost like magic, right? And you know, for me at the time, because I was a Reaganite, my parents were a Reaganite, I thought, oh my God, this is how much power this guy has, Reagan. He's merely inaugurated, and the Iranians cry uncle and they free the hostages, right? But that's not what happened. What happened is that Reagan affirmatively worked to have his own countrymen and women held longer in captivity in Tehran so he could win the election. If every American knew this, Reagan, his name would be mud, right? I mean, this is an incredible fact. This is treason. This is the highest form of treason you could think of. He violated so many norms of law, of loyalty to his country. He's trying to undermine a sitting president, trying to have his own country people held longer. He's violating the Logan Act, which prevents private citizens from doing their own foreign policy work. You know, in many countries, had this been found out, Reagan would have been tried and put up before a firing squad. And instead, he's considered this great president, you know.
St. Ronald.
St. Ronald. But this shows how, again, our machinations in other countries come home to roost many times, how much, you know, our attempts to intervene in other countries distort our own democracy. And really, Russiagate's another example of it. You know, our own, in this case, it really was the Democratic Party and its allies in the government. Their own, dealing, I mean, their own self-interest, which led them to come up with the Russiagate lie, was a big part of why they did what they did to try to convince the American people that the 2016 election was unfair and that Russia intervened. But it was also motivated by longer-term goals of wanting to have a conflict with Russia of the type we're seeing now, right? I mean, they didn't pick Russia out just out of a hat. And again, we see how that hatred towards Russia, the desire to attack Russia, destroy Russia, has undermined our own democracy. First, it undermined many people's belief in the 2016 elections because they, even to this day, believe that Russia intervened in it, right? Once you tell that lie and you perpetuate that lie for years, it never goes away. The smell of it never goes away. Even if people are told, oh, well, that's been debunked, they may either deny that or they'll maybe agree, but they still know in their hearts somehow Russia did something. I don't know what it was, but it was something bad. Right? Those lies have long-term consequences for our democracy, and they will continue to. And it's troubling. Yeah, I mean, and so, yeah, again, and a lot of it's projection in any case. A lot of it, claiming that Russia is interfering in our elections is a huge case of psychological projection, you know, where you accuse someone else of doing or being what you are, which is a very human thing to do. If I'm a thief, I will accuse you of being a thief, right? And because in a way, I assume everyone's a thief. And that's what the U.S. does. It accuses other countries of intervening in other people's elections when no one has intervened in more elections than the United States. I mean, it's not even a close call. So
that was an amazing history lesson, Dan. I didn't know that about Ronald Reagan. I'm surprised because I thought I've been catching up on a lot of stuff here in the last dozen years or so. Anyway, I want to get back to the plot to overthrow the world. On another level, on a geopolitical level, you've got Klaus Schwab, his World Economic Forum, and working towards creating this new world order. What are your thoughts about that? This is just not trying to influence elections. He's had his own leadership academy when most of the leaders, elected and unelected in Europe, Canada, I don't know about the United States, but certainly these other countries. Um, I'd like your comments on Klaus Schwab and what's going on there.
Yeah, well, first of all, I do want to say that's probably not my kind of area of expertise so much. There's other people like Whitney Webb who could probably speak better, but about it. But essentially, it is as you say, it's a really cabal of the Western elite who, as you say, are trying to create a new world order for the next many decades. An economy, they want to create an economy essentially even more oppressed labor than they have now. Um, they're kind of looking towards a post industrial society, where people are basically in a kind of semi status of serfdom. He talks about people will own nothing, but they'll be happy. They will be indebted. They will not own their own homes. They will have little habitations, which are now being, of course, kind of lauded. These ideas of mini homes and different things, or even pods, people living in pods. These are being lauded as kind of environmentally friendly things, which they may be, but they're being pushed not for that, but because essentially this is an attempt to subjugate even further what the elites see as the surplus population. Right. Part of it is they think there's too many people in the world. They want to dominate all the resources, and they want the rest of us to have as little as possible, but also to be happy in a certain way, because they don't want rebellion either. Which has led us to this kind of brave new world. A lot of people look to 1984, George Orwell's 1984, as kind of the recipe for the world we have now. But I think Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is more accurate, because that describes a world that's ruled not through brute force, not through the boot stepping on the human hand forever, as discussed in Orwell's book, though that'll happen if necessary, of course. But it's more of a world ruled through entertaining people to death, so that they're now, I mean, the example is they're on their phones 24 hours 7. They're essentially addicted to watching things of no matter, puppy videos for hours on end or whatnot. If they're unhappy, there's pills for them to be happy. And now, and again, I don't want to sound like a prude or but now I think the ruling class has decided that marijuana is a great thing, because that really makes people into passive people. So you see marijuana becoming a huge part of culture now, in a way it never has, because now, of course, it's mostly legal and it's easy to get in many different forms, including edible forms and whatnot. Which, again, I'm not against marijuana, but I mean, I think per se, but this is part of the package of keeping people docile and, again, happy, in the words of Aldous Huxley in his book with Soma. We now have Zoloft instead, and other things. And happy in that case means passive, and that's what we are headed towards. I mean, but the other thing that the elite wants to create is a monoculture, right? Part of the ability to create this world order that's structured the way they want it to is to eradicate really ancient cultures, right? They want one culture, and they really don't want any culture. Sorry, a call came in and that screwed things up. So they don't want culture. They want to destroy culture. And why? Because that prevents control over people, right? If they have their own language, their own cultures, it's a way, it's a way for people to preserve really their own self-control and sovereignty and whatnot, right? And see, you see this process happening in every country the U.S. violently intervenes in. Iraq, for example, is a great example. They allowed the mass looting of antiquities, the destruction of ancient buildings, and they really are taking a sledgehammer to the old world, what they consider to be the old world. Their vision is more turning the world into a giant parking lot with a few McDonald's and Starbucks next to it. And that may sound harsh, but if you look at Libya, what we did to that country, or Iraq, or Afghanistan, that really is the model for the future. It's not democracy, it's chaos. And what I think that brings us to the current conflict with Russia. What the Russians see this, okay? And the Russians see that the U.S. wants to balkanize Russia. They call it decolonize Russia. And what they fear is what the U.S. wants to do is destroy the Russian culture. The Russian language, Russian religion, the Orthodox faith. And we see, of course, in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, allied with NATO, is destroying the Orthodox Church to the extent it still is answers to the patriarch in Moscow, actually burning down churches. And so the Russians don't, they're not far off in what they think is happening. They see this as a fight, not just for, territorial integrity, but really for civilization and for culture, period. Again, this is a huge discussion, but that's how I see things playing out.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. You ended on the note about Russia. Putin finally, very recently, called out the United States and the West for their neoliberal, satanic values. And he's drawn the line. He wants none of that to come to Russia. I think you're exactly right. These people, they talk about the golden billion. They don't want 7 or 8 billion people in the world. They have no use for them. They're a drain on them and their wealth. So they're eugenicists. And I think this whole effort to create this new world order is you mentioned about destroying civilization, culture, religion, traditional values. That's a process of dehumanization. They're denying and want to deny what makes us human. They want to deny the richness of various cultures, histories. And I think that this has to be fought tooth and nail. I think Russia knows that it's not just about its existence as a country, its existence as a civilization. And you mentioned humanity. It's humanity's existence that I think is at stake. Dan, I want to thank you so much. We're going to have you back again. These are great discussions, and I really do appreciate it. I want to wish you continued success in getting the word out, and I know you're doing a hell of a job at that with your articles, your appearance on various shows. My hat's off to you, my friend. Take care.
And to you, Regis. Thank you.